Hello and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the strange and obscure corners of Ireland and Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and in this episode, I'm going to tell you about the Tipperary Joint Stock Bank scandal. This story begins in 1802, when a farmer named James Scully decided to open a bank. Scully was 65 years old at the time and had a long and successful farming career behind him. He was from a Catholic farming family, and a combination of inherited wealth and shrewd business acumen meant that by 1792 he held over 4,000 acres of farmland. Between the land and buildings, he had over £40,000 in property, making him one of the richest farmers in Tipperary. About half the land was farmed by him personally, with the other half rented out. He would go on to double this during the rest of his life. This was all possible due to the Catholic Relief Act of 1782, which had eased the legal restrictions on Catholics owning land. The European wars of the 1790s drove food prices up, and this gave Scully a great deal of cash in hand. He decided to use some of it to open a bank. At the time, local country banks like this were becoming more and more common. The evolving financial landscape meant that successful farmers and landlords like James Scully needed banking services, while the large established banks didn't see the point in operating outside of London. When James Scully and his partners opened their bank in Tipperary, there were about 400 of them operating throughout Britain and Ireland. This was in large part driven by the influx of cash into the provinces caused by the payment of wages to soldiers fighting abroad. There was little regulation of these banks and no protection or insurance on deposits. As a result, hundreds of them failed and the depositors lost all of their funds. In the last 2 years of James Scully's life, before his death in 1816, he would have seen 89 banks fail, and he might have been proud that the Tipperary Bank was not one of them. Where the bank went after his death became the subject of legal contention. His surviving sons Dennis and James were his primary heirs and the executors of his will. However, the will was contested by his wife, leading to a legal battle over the division of his fortune. The brothers lost the court case, but they still seem to have done well out of their father's estate. James Jr. inherited the bank, although it doesn't seem to have been a major enterprise at that time. This may have been a blessing in disguise for him, as there was a financial crisis in 1825 that caused the failure of 93 banks across the country, out of the over 600 operating at the time. The outcome of this crisis would have implications for the Tipperary Bank down the line, so let's look at it for a moment. Generally known as the Panic of 1825, it had been on the horizon for the last decade after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. These wars had been very expensive for the government and very profitable for the military contractors, which led to a large amount of capital being available for investment. It was a boom that quickly turned into a bubble focused on investments in South America. At the same time, the Bank of England was attempting to move off its wartime financial policies and back onto the gold standard, which led to there being a fluctuating amount of Bank of England notes in circulation. The fact that country banks were able to print their own notes meant that a large number of them spread into use. This was a recipe for disaster, and a drop in the price of those Latin American investments forced several banks to declare themselves insolvent. People realized that this made the notes issued by those banks worthless, and so they began a run on the other country banks to change their notes for cash. Naturally, this led to a cascade effect, with more and more banks failing. In situations like this, the Bank of England was supposed to act as the lender of last resort, providing emergency loans to the banks to keep them afloat. But they had never needed to do this before, and the concept was unfamiliar to them. As a result, they were late to intervene. The entire financial system came very close to collapse, and the fatal weakness of the country bank system was exposed. The government passed new laws, and the ability of the banks to print their own notes was curtailed. They also introduced a new type of bank, the Joint Stock Retail Bank. Before this, private banks could only have a maximum of 6 joint owners. Now they could have an unlimited number of shareholders. The idea was that these banks would be managed and directed by professionals rather than directly by the small number of inexperienced bank owners. It was a popular move. Within 10 years, over 100 joint stock banks popped up around the country. This caught the attention of James Scully Jr., and he decided to reform the Tipperary Bank as a joint stock bank. In order to help him do this, he recruited his two nephews, John and James Sadleir. The Sadleirs were the sons of James's sister Joanna, who had married a Protestant farmer named Clement William Sadleir. As was usual in cases of mixed marriages like this, they were raised in their mother's religion of Catholicism. John was born in 1813 and James in 1815. John qualified as a solicitor and was apprenticed to his cousin Nicholas. James Sadleir is less well documented, though it seems likely he was involved in finance of some sort. When James Scully Jr. decided to form his joint stock bank, James Sadleir eventually became managing director. John was involved in recruiting shareholders, and Scully Jr.'s son James, who I'll refer to as Scully III, also took an active part in the business. They managed to get 100 shareholders to buy into the bank, and with these funds they were able to expand it out to 9 branches across 3 counties. The head office was in Clonmel, and it had branches in Neenah, Turles, Carrick-on-Suir, Thomastown, Roscrea, Athy, Carlisle, and, of course, Tipperary town. 1846 was a pivotal year in the history of the Tipperary Joint Stock Bank. 2 things happened that would eventually seal its unfortunate fate. The first was that James Scully, son of the founder of the bank and the person who had led it to its current success, died. He was succeeded by his son James Scully III, who was a much weaker character. The second thing that happened was that John Sadleir quit his job as a solicitor in Dublin and moved to London. He was drawn there by railway mania, the investment bubble that was gripping the country at the time. 263 Acts of Parliament were passed that year to establish railway companies, although only 2/3 of them would ever be built. The bubble burst in 1847, but this actually seems to have helped John, as he swooped in to snap up shares at a bargain price. He invested in a railway in East Kent, as well as European railways in countries like Sweden, France and Italy. He also became a land speculator, and would spend £233,000 buying land over the next 10 years. That's over £31 million in modern money. As for where he got that money, we'll get to that. Part of why John's wealth was unquestioned was because he had moved into the realm of politics, and people took it for granted that politicians would be wealthy. In 1847, he contested one of the 2 MP seats for Carlow as a member of the Whig Party, and won. That was in a general election with an unusual result. The Conservative Party won the most seats, though with 325 MPs, they fell 4 seats short of a majority. However, the Conservative Party at the time was divided, with Robert Peel leading a breakaway faction who refused to caucus with the rest of the party. This meant that the leader of the Whigs, Lord John Russell, was the one who became Prime Minister. John was a backbencher, but he was a backbencher for the ruling party, which came with its own rewards. Some of those rewards arrived in 1849 with the passage of the Encumbered Estates Act. This was an act of Parliament designed to provide relief to people impacted by the ongoing famine in Ireland. Not the million poor Irish who died, of course. No, I'm talking about the type of victims that MPs really felt empathy for. The landlords, who fell into debt because their labourers were starving to death and their tenant farmers couldn't pay their rent. They couldn't sell their land to pay these debts because their estates were usually bound together with an entail, a legal contract that prevented it being broken up. This is an oversimplification, but 19th century real estate law is not the main topic of this podcast. The important thing was that the new law allowed for land in these estates to be sold off to pay the debts if the creditors applied for that to happen. Generally, the land would be priced below market value to allow for a quick sale, and there was an expectation that the original owner would probably buy the land back at a premium if their financial situation improved. There was a clear opportunity here for people with a large amount of capital to turn it into an even larger amount. The main risk was that the money would be tied up in the land until it could be sold. Still, over the following decades, millions of acres of land changed hands. John Sadleir bought over 30,000 acres, and this is where that £233,000 went. The sequence of events that would lead to John's downfall began in 1851 with the passage of the Ecclesiastical Titles Act. Over the previous 20 years, since a law in 1829 restored most civil rights to Catholics, their situation had been gradually improving, and the Catholic priesthood had been organising in public. In 1850, Pope Pius IX recognised this by officially re-establishing Catholic parishes across the British Isles. This was seen as an attack by hardline Protestants, who rallied the public against it. In November of 1850, Dr. Maltby, the Anglican Bishop of Durham, wrote to the government describing the Pope's move as an insolent and insidious act of aggression. Lord John Russell, the Prime Minister, wrote back agreeing strongly with the bishop and making several anti-Catholic remarks of his own. Unfortunately for him, the latter was leaked, and it established in people's minds that the government was going to act on the issue. In fact, none of them really wanted to. They were now forced to by the weight of public opinion. The result was the Ecclesiastical Titles Act, which made it a crime for anyone to use a religious title that gave them authority over any district or city. The obvious exception, of course, was Anglican and Episcopal clergymen. It had very little real effect, as the Catholic bishops simply didn't use those titles for the 20 years until the Act was repealed. But symbolically, it was taken as a sign that Parliament was still prepared to pass laws targeting Catholics. As such, it led to a group of Catholic MPs from across party divides coming together to oppose it. This included John Sadleir, as well as two of his cousins who were also MPs, Frank Scully and Robert Keating. Other leading lights included the MP for Athlone, William Keogh, and the MP for Mayo, George Henry Moore. In 1852, John joined up with Keogh and Moore to form the Catholic Defence Association in Dublin. Ironically, this was a movement that mostly drew its support from tenant farmers who'd been hard done by in the property sales caused by the Encumbered Estates Act. Those farmers had formed the Tenants' Right League, a short-lived organisation that managed to bring together unionist tenant farmers in the north and nationalist tenant farmers in the south to recognise their common class struggle. John was one of several Irish MPs who abandoned their party affiliation to take an endorsement from the Tenants' Right League. 48 MPs were elected with that endorsement in the 1852 general election, and one of them was John Sadleir. Incidentally, the 1852 election saw two more grandsons of James Scully Sr. become MPs, although neither of them were endorsed by the Tenants' Right League. One of them was Vincent Scully, who stood on a platform against the Ecclesiastical Titles Bill but chose to remain independent. The other was John's brother, James Sadleir. He stood as the Whig candidate for Tipperary and remained uninvolved in the religious debate. John, on the other hand, now chose to join a party whose single-issue focus was the Ecclesiastical Titles Act. They called themselves the Independent Ireland Party, and their members pledged to refuse to take part in government until the Act was repealed. Their absence led to there being no overall majority for any party in the Commons. Initially, the Conservatives formed a government, but the party remained divided, and so the opposition was able to vote them out. The Whigs and the Progressive Conservatives went on to form a coalition government, and the new government offered posts to several members of the Independent Ireland Party in an attempt to bring them on board. Two members accepted this deal, forever labelling themselves as traitors in the eyes of the Irish public. One was William Keogh, who became Solicitor General for Ireland. The other was John Sadleir. The role that John accepted was that of Junior Lord of the Treasury, a grand-sounding title for a less grand job. They're more commonly known as party whips, the people who are responsible for making sure the party members turn up for votes and toe the party line. They do get to sit in the Treasury Board, which is probably why John accepted it. It's also possible that John regretted leaving the Whigs after they got back into government, so he thought that taking the post would help him get back into the corridors of power. Switching party like this meant that he did have to resign and stand for re-election, but he expected that to be a formality. He was reportedly enraged when he lost the by-election, especially when he found out that some customers of the Tipperary Bank hadn't supported him. Luckily for him, the MP for the city of Sligo had just been unseated because of bribing the electors. Sligo was a notoriously corrupt constituency, and in fact it was dissolved in 1868 because it was considered a lost cause. But even by Sligo standards, the election of John Sadleir was controversial. The Tablet, a Catholic newspaper published in London, did not mince words. It described Sligo as renowned throughout the habitable globe for the prostitute venality of its voters. John himself was referred to as the Judas pet of the murderous Whigs. John probably didn't care, as he was back in government and able to continue his land speculation. He also began trading in commodities, specifically hemp, iron and sugar. Unfortunately, like many before him, he found the stock market treacherous waters to swim in, and he lost a great deal of money. However, he wasn't worried. He knew that the profits from his land speculation would be more than enough to cover it. All he needed was time. but time was something he didn't have. His enemies in Ireland were looking for anything they could use to bring him down, and they didn't have to look for long. In the aftermath of losing the Carlow election, John's anger had driven him to go too far. One customer of the Tipperary Bank named Dowling had been particularly outspoken against him, and John took it as a personal insult. He had the man abducted and beaten. When the story came out in 1854, John was forced to resign his government job in disgrace. Worse, he had embarrassed the Treasury, and they started investigating his affairs. Things began to unravel over the next 2 years. The truth was that all of John's speculation had been financed by a massive overdraft of £288,000 at the Tipperary Bank. That's over £40 million in today's money, and it basically represented all of the reserves that the bank should have had. His brother James was the chairman and managing director for the bank, and he covered for his brother's embezzlement with false reports that claimed the bank was doing well. The main problem was that the bank was having to refuse loans it didn't have the capital to cover, and people were beginning to take notice. John took out loans from London banks as well, and embarked on a series of schemes to try to bring liquid cash into the Tipperary. One of the few vaguely legitimate ones was when he bought a small bank in Newcastle using drafts drawn on the Tipperary, and he and James then absorbed its reserves to bolster their bank. Others were straightforwardly criminal. He held the position of chairman of the Royal Swedish Railway Company, which was a joint Anglo-Swedish company that exported British expertise and equipment to build railways in Sweden. John forged tens of thousands of shares in the company and sold them to people like his cousin Thomas Eyre. He also allegedly forged land deeds, embezzled funds entrusted to him as a solicitor, and did whatever he could to keep afloat. But it wasn't enough. In February of 1856, the London agents of the bank refused to allow someone to withdraw their savings in the Tipperary, as they had not left enough cash with them to honour it. The news provoked a panic. The Bank of Ireland in Dublin made the decision to keep honouring the drafts for the moment, and this provoked a mad rush of creditors to them to withdraw their savings. John knew the jig was up. Nothing awaited him but disgrace and prison. So on the night of the 16th of February, he wrote a long letter to Emma, his brother James's wife. After sending it, he took a carriage into Hampstead Heath and dismissed his driver. Then he took a bottle of the oil of bitter almonds, a substance containing a large concentration of cyanide, and he drank it. His body was found the next morning. John's corpse was discovered on a Sunday morning, and on Monday the Bank of Ireland declared they would accept no more notes drawn on the Tipperary Joint Stock Bank. The news provoked a panic across the Midlands. People flocked to the branches of the bank, demanding their money. In one case, a riotous mob broke down a door and started digging up the floor of the bank to try to find a secret vault. The police had to take up positions outside the bank's headquarters for fear that workers there would be lynched. As it became clear that people's savings were completely lost, hundreds of small personal tragedies took place. The most horrific was when a farmer beat his wife to death in a rage, blaming her for their savings of £350 being in the bank. In another case, a woman had lost her life savings of £100 that she had wanted to use to help her stepson emigrate to America. One of the largest individual losers was the parish church in Thomastown. They lost the £2,000 that had been donated by parishioners to repair the church roof. At the other end of the scale, 800 people with less than £50 lost all the money in their accounts. Thousands of people's lives were damaged by the criminal misconduct of the Sadleir brothers, and the trauma marked the county for years. The biggest creditor of the bank was the Bank of Ireland, since they had taken all those notes in the last week. But unlike the poor of Tipperary, they had the resources to try to recover it. In the suicide note he had sent to his brother's wife, John claimed sole responsibility for the fall of the bank. This was later proved to be a complete lie, as letters between the brothers discussing the fraud were found. In the short term, it didn't matter. The bank did not have limited liability, which meant that the partners could be held responsible for the debts of the company. James Scully was considered to be a fool rather than a criminal, but he was a fool who the courts ordered to pay £15,000. His brother Vincent had to pay £10,000 and lost his seat as an MP in the next election. The Scullys and the Keatings fell out, as the Scully brothers blamed their cousin Robert Keating for having propped up John Sadleir. Robert was a director at the London and County Bank, which had made John several loans. Not all the partners were part of the family. For example, Wilson Kennedy, a local Presbyterian elder, had been a founding partner and served as director. He was not only bankrupted, but also accused of being aware of the fraud and covering for it, because John Sadleir had helped him to win a legal case. Other people were also caught up in the scandal, or had their own misdeeds exposed in the investigation. In a previous episode, for example, we mentioned Captain William Stewart, the business partner of Dion Boucicault in his first American tour. Stewart's real name was Edmund O'Flaherty, and he had fled London after he was implicated in John's forgery. Of course, the main target of consequences was James Sadleir. On the 29th of February, the first lawsuit was filed against him, and this was swiftly followed by many others. First, the papers were broadly sympathetic to him. The initial investigation accepted that he was just another of his brother's victims, and he was thought of as a man ruined by too much sibling affection. Of course, then the letters between him and John were discovered. James knew that was coming, so he and his wife fled the country. He was last seen in Ireland on the 17th of June 1856. A month later, on the 18th of July, charges were officially filed against him. It's a matter of heated debate as why they hadn't been filed before he vanished. Nobody knew where James had gone. The police searched for him in New Orleans, while the papers speculated he was in South America. In fact, he was in Paris, and this was widely known by February the next year. That was also when he was finally officially expelled from Parliament for refusal to surrender to arrest. This was something that had been debated for several months at this point. The first motion to expel James Sadleir was tabled on the 24th of July 1856, less than a week after James was charged. It was put forth by John Arthur Roebuck, a backbencher who was notorious for taking any opportunity to attack whatever government was in power. He pointed to the case of George Robinson, a century before, who had been expelled from Parliament for exactly the same offence. The motion was seconded by Sir Charles Napier, former Navy Admiral who had fought alongside Nelson. That motion was defeated, but 7 months later the government were forced to take action. In the meantime, James Sadleir's entire estate had been seized and sold to cover the bank's debts. He and his wife survived on an allowance paid to them by her family. A letter he sent from Paris was published in the Dublin Evening Post that May. In it, he continued to claim his innocence, a claim that was firmly rebutted by James Scully among others. James Sadleir never returned to Ireland, spent the rest of his life first in France and then in Switzerland. In 1881, at the age of 66, he was out for a walk in Zurich when a mugger demanded he hand over his gold watch. James refused, and the man stabbed him. It took a week for them to find his body. An ignominious end for someone who had helped to ruin so many lives. The scandal, especially the suicide of John Sadleir, had a major impact on Victorian society. Both Charles Dickens and Anthony Trollope based characters on John and his death. Several other novels and plays were also inspired by the affair. But the biggest impact remained on the people of Tipperary and the surrounding counties. It took decades for the economy of the county to recover, not least because the encumbered estates John had bought were also caught up in the affair. Even in modern times, it's a cliché that older farmers will keep some of their money hidden in their house rather than in the bank. Despite all the protections in place in modern banking, it's easy to understand why some of them might feel that way. Once bitten, twice shy, after all. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.